Story 1. Brace yourself for the absolute terror I am about to share. I do not even know if this is the right place for a story like this, but I have to put it out there. I have told everyone I can think of, my family, my neighbors, my friends, even a few news outlets. It is never enough. I cannot explain it, but I feel this strange obligation to warn as many people as possible about what has been happening to me. So, here it goes. It is November of 2019 as I write this, but the story stretches way back. I am talking at least 7 years. I cannot tell you the exact year off the top of my head, but let us say 2012. It might have been 2013, but that is my best guess. I was in my mid-20s, had a steady job, and was dating my girlfriend, who is now my fiancée. I never went to college, so I had been in the workforce for a while, and my life was pretty stable. Because of that, I never had a reason to move far from home, so I did not. At the time, my girlfriend and I had just moved into my childhood home. My parents passed it down to me, giving me my first house. It is an old brick home, something my dad inherited from his parents when he was around 40. The house has been renovated a few times, but you can still tell how old it is. The brickwork gives it away. There are very few brick houses in the area, so ours stands out. I have always liked that. It makes the place feel unique. Our neighborhood is surrounded by woods, and the houses are spaced far apart. We live at the very end of the street, which means instead of bordering the woods on one side, we are surrounded on two. The forest back there is enormous. As a kid, my brothers and I would spend hours exploring, but no matter how far we wandered, we never came close to covering the whole thing. Some people might find that intimidating, but I have always loved the wilderness. I enjoy my space, and having my own little corner of the world seemed perfect. My girlfriend and I had only been living there for a few months when it all started. It was winter. I cannot remember which month exactly, but I know there was snow on the ground. It was a Sunday morning, the one day of the week I got to sleep in. Around 8 a.m., I got in my truck, ready to go grab a coffee, something I did every Sunday. That is when I saw them, footprints in the snow, right next to my truck. At first, I thought maybe my girlfriend had woken up before me and stepped outside for some reason. But the more I looked at the tracks, the more I realized that was impossible. The footprints came from the woods, crossed my yard, and stopped right next to my driver's side door. Then, they turned around and went straight back into the woods. No path led to the house. Someone had walked straight from the trees to my truck and then left. It made no sense. Later that day, I asked my girlfriend about it, but of course, she had not been outside. I wish I remembered more details, but it was so long ago that most of it is a blur. It must have been 2 winters later when the next thing happened. I know it was 2015 because I remember my Seahawks lost the Super Bowl to Tom Brady that year. I walked outside to my truck that morning and instantly knew something was wrong. Footprints were everywhere. They covered the driveway, circled the windows, and lined the perimeter of the house. I am a level-headed guy, so I will not say I panicked, but I would be lying if I said I was completely calm. I was already late for work, so I did not have time to investigate, but I made a quick sweep around the yard to make sure no one was still there. Nothing. As I pulled out of the driveway, I texted my girlfriend to let her know what I had seen so she would not be caught off guard. I could not focus at work, so I ended up leaving early. By the time I got home, my girlfriend had made a disturbing discovery. She pointed at one of the trails and told me something had been bothering her all day. I took a closer look and felt my stomach drop. There were no shoe prints. Whoever left those tracks had been walking barefoot. Who the hell would walk around barefoot in the snow? My girlfriend suggested maybe it was an animal, but these prints were unmistakably human. We called my dad, and he told me he had never experienced anything like that while living in the house. He told me to grab my rifle and try to track whoever it was. I did not want to, but I knew it was my responsibility. I slung my rifle over my shoulder and followed the tracks into the woods. I told myself I would turn back before dark. After about 30 minutes, the trail suddenly split in two. That should not have been possible. Either there was more than one person, or someone had walked backwards to confuse me. I did not like either possibility. I stood there for a while, then decided I had had enough. It was getting dark, and I was not about to get lost out there. That night, we called the police, but as I predicted, they said there was not much they could do. By morning, fresh snowfall had covered the tracks. For a few years, nothing happened. My girlfriend and I got engaged, and life moved on. I almost forgot about it. But then, this past January, it started again. I woke up to find footprints covering my yard. This time, they led to my shed. A bunch of my tools were missing. I was furious. I called my friend Theo, an experienced hunter, and asked him to help me track whoever was doing this. That night, we followed the footprints deep into the woods. Just like before, the trail split multiple times, but we kept going. Eventually, Theo stopped dead in his tracks and raised his rifle. He motioned for me to look through his thermal scope. What I saw still haunts me. For figures huddled in the snow. At first, I thought they were animals, but they were human. 2 large ones, 2 smaller ones. The small ones were clinging to a tree, jerking their heads around. They were eating something, and they were naked. After a while, the larger figures picked up the smaller ones and walked deeper into the woods. Theo and I sat there, frozen in fear, until we were sure they were gone. When we finally made it home, my fiancée was still awake. I told her what we saw, but I kept the details vague. The police searched the woods the next morning but found nothing. They told us they could not launch a major search over some missing tools. I do not blame them, but it did not feel like closure. Winter is coming again, and my fiancé and I are terrified they will return. We are seriously considering moving, but we have not started the process yet. I have no idea why our house is the target. My neighbors have never had anything like this happen. Some of my friends say they are harmless, but others say we are in real danger. I think I am going to try sealing off the yard, but beyond that, I do not know what else to do. Hopefully, we can move soon. Story 2. Last summer, I decided to take on a major section of the Pacific Crest Trail. I have always loved hiking, especially solo trips. My plan was simple: park my car at the end of the section, hitch a ride to the trailhead, and hike back over the course of about 10 days. It seemed straightforward enough at the time. The first few days went smoothly, just as I had expected. The trail was everything I had hoped for. Endless stretches of towering trees and winding paths cutting through serene landscapes. I am in pretty good shape, so I do not have to stop often while hiking. Of course, I am not going to hike in the dark, so every night I set up camp to get some rest. Since I was alone, I made sure to stay off the main trail when pitching my tent. I figured it was safer that way, less chance of someone stumbling across my campsite. Up until the 3rd night, everything was going fine. But what happened next is the reason why I am taking an extended break from hiking, or any kind of wilderness exploration, for that matter. I woke up in the middle of the night with a gut feeling that something was wrong. It was the kind of instinct you do not question. I sat up and looked around my tent. Everything inside seemed normal, but I felt uneasy, so I grabbed my rifle and flashlight and stepped outside to check the area. There was nothing out there. At least, nothing I could see. I returned to my tent and started going through my gear. That is when I realized my wallet was gone. At first, I thought I had misplaced it, maybe left it outside or buried it in my pack. But after tearing through everything, I had to accept the fact that someone had taken it. My cash, credit cards, personal information, gone. The weirdest part? Nothing else was missing. Who would sneak into my tent just to take my wallet and leave everything else? I tried to convince myself that I had just lost it, but over the next few days, things kept disappearing, small items at first. One of my lighters, my Swiss Army knife, a few energy bars. I knew I was not just being forgetful. Someone was stealing my things. By the 4th day, I could no longer deny it. I was being stalked. There was no cell service in that part of the trail, so I could not call for help. I thought about turning back, but it would have only saved me a couple of days. Either way, I would have to sleep in the woods again, and I did not feel comfortable doing that anymore. I kept telling myself that I had my rifle for a reason, but then it hit me. Why had the person not taken my gun? It was almost like they wanted to mess with me. That night, I tied my tent shut from the inside, hoping it would keep them out if they returned. I tried to stay awake as long as possible, but exhaustion eventually took over. When I woke up the next morning, my tent was undisturbed. Still, the paranoia had fully set in. Every second of hiking was pure agony. I do not have anxiety, but I have never felt worse in my life than I did over the next few days. Just imagine knowing someone is lurking nearby, watching you, and there is nothing you can do about it. My mind started playing tricks on me. I kept hearing rustling in the bushes, but when I turned, there was nothing. I saw flickering shadows in my peripheral vision that vanished when I looked directly at them. The hallucinations got worse. The one I remember most clearly happened while I was walking. I suddenly stepped into what felt like an ankle-deep puddle. I heard the splash, felt the cold water soak my sock. But when I looked down, the ground was dry. I stood there in complete shock. It had felt so real. As bad as the days were, the nights were worse. I slept next to my rifle, but nothing made me feel safe. One night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps circling my campsite. My body was frozen with fear. I clutched my rifle, ready to confront whoever was out there, but the footsteps eventually faded into the trees. There was no way I was going back to sleep after that. At sunrise, I packed up in a frenzy, my hands shaking so badly I could barely tie my gear. I was done. I could not spend another night in those woods. I was close, probably a little over a day's hike from my car. Maybe less if I pushed hard. I made the decision right then and there. I was not stopping. I was going to hike through the night and get out of there as fast as possible. I moved as quickly as my body would allow, pushing through the exhaustion. When the sun set, I gritted my teeth and kept going, flashlight in one hand, rifle in the other. It was the first time I had ever hiked in complete darkness, and it was terrifying. Every little sound made my heart pound. Then, about an hour from the trail's end, I heard something behind me. Footsteps. I spun around and flashed my light. My stomach dropped. Something had just moved behind a tree. I aimed my rifle, my voice shaking as I shouted for them to come out. A figure stepped forward. It was a man. But when I tell you he was the most barbaric-looking person I had ever seen, I am not exaggerating. His face was covered in hair, his skin scratched up and filthy, and he was wearing nothing but a pair of my shorts. I had not even realized they were missing. He started walking toward me despite my rifle being aimed directly at him. Without thinking, I fired a warning shot into the dirt beside him. He flinched, then turned and sprinted into the woods. I did not wait around. I bolted toward my car, running as fast as my legs would carry me. When I finally made it out, I jumped in, locked the doors, and called the police. When they arrived, they told me I should leave immediately. I did not need to be told twice. I was gone that night. The craziest part of the whole thing? The hallucinations. I had no idea my mind could create something so vivid. It is going to be a long time before I go hiking again, and when I do, I will not be alone. If you are planning on hiking the Pacific Crest Trail, be extremely cautious and carry a firearm. I still think about this experience all the time. Story 3. I apologize in advance if I get any details wrong, but this is a story my best friend told me multiple times years ago. It is one of those stories that sticks with you, no matter how many times you hear it. My friend's dad was a logger, specifically a tree saw operator. For those unfamiliar, a tree saw is a massive machine capable of cutting down towering trees and slicing them into precise lengths. His job meant long, grueling hours, often alone in the deep, isolated forests of the Pacific Northwest. The way his crew worked, he was paid per tree cut rather than by the hour. So he often pushed himself to work 16 to 20-hour days to finish jobs as quickly as possible. Once he and his coworker completed their part, the rest of the crew would come in to clear the felled trees and transport them to the mill. He spent about half of his time working alone, and the other half with his friend Griffin, another tree saw operator. They used radios to stay in contact, especially when they worked on opposite ends of a job site. Years ago, my friend's dad and Griffin were assigned to a remote logging site high up in the mountains. It took their company over 3 weeks just to clear a road wide enough for their trucks and equipment. By the time they began working, they were in an incredibly secluded part of the wilderness. 10 days in, things started getting weird. Strange chatter began coming through their radios. At first, just muffled, static-laden murmurs that made no sense. They tried switching channels, but no matter what they did, the voices followed them. If you have ever used a standard radio, you know how odd that is. It should not have been possible for someone to follow them across frequencies. As they moved farther up the mountain, the voices became clearer. They could not make out full conversations, but the snippets they caught felt off. Sometimes the words were casual, almost mundane, but still unintelligible. And then there were the signs that someone else had been there before them. Random containers, footprints in the dirt, makeshift campsites. They were in a place so remote that it was practically inaccessible. No one else should have been there. One day, Griffin stumbled upon a tent hidden just off a trail and called my friend's dad over. They decided to investigate. Inside, they found a single sleeping bag and a duffel bag filled with the most unsettling things imaginable. Multiple pairs of children's underwear, duct tape, rope, and crude sketches of children being harmed. There were even photos of a fresh apple, suggesting that whoever owned the bag had been there recently. Griffin immediately wanted to pack up and leave, but my friend's dad, ever the workaholic, insisted they finish the job. They agreed to keep radio communication to a minimum and continued working. That night, they sat in their camper, unsettled and restless. The radio crackled again. This time, they could make out fragments of a conversation between two men. They were talking about gathering water and firewood, mundane topics, but the realization that these men might be connected to the tent sent a chill down my friend's dad's spine. Griffin was not as shaken, but my friend's dad could not shake the growing sense of unease. The next night, when the voices returned, my friend's dad decided to confront them. He grabbed the radio and demanded to know who they were and what they were doing there. Instantly, the voices went silent. That silence was almost worse than the talking. Griffin was furious that he had revealed their presence, and the two of them argued briefly before agreeing not to escalate the situation any further. Around midnight, Griffin shook my friend's dad awake, whispering that someone was outside the camper. The first thing he noticed was the soft crunch of footsteps on gravel. His heart pounded as he fumbled for his gun, only to realize it was not loaded. He had no idea where his ammunition was. The handle of the camper door jiggled. The door creaked open slightly, but did not swing inward. Their camper was high off the ground, with no ladder or stool to climb up. Then came the scratching, long, deliberate scratches along the outside of the door. For agonizing minutes passed before my friend's dad finally nodded at Griffin, signaling that he was going to check it out. He moved quietly toward the door, gripping a flashlight in his trembling hand. Just as he reached for the handle, the door suddenly burst open. He was struck across the face with a knife. Pain blinded him as he fell out of the camper, slamming into the ground. Before he could react, a man was on top of him, pressing the blade against his neck. Another figure appeared and began kicking him repeatedly in the head. Griffin did not hesitate. He lunged out of the camper and tackled the man with the knife. The second attacker bolted into the darkness, and the man Griffin tackled scrambled to his feet and ran after him, disappearing into the trees. Griffin helped my friend's dad into their truck, and they sped 2 hours to the nearest hospital. His face was a mess of cuts and bruises, and a deep gash across his eye permanently damaged his vision. They reported the attack to the police, but nothing ever came of it. 2 weeks later, when the rest of the logging crew arrived to finish the job, they made a horrifying discovery. One of their co-workers was found bound, gagged, assaulted, and murdered in a ditch. No arrests were ever made. To this day, my friend's dad struggles with PTSD. His right eye, with its disfigured pupil, is a constant reminder of that night. I have not heard from my friend or his dad in years, but I can only hope he is doing okay. After hearing this story, I have never been able to shake my fear of deep woods, and honestly, I do not think I ever will.